So a big thank you to everyone who's attended. And John Carberry, a big thank you to you, John. John was the person who first approached me and asked me to present here. And it's a real honour for me to lecture here this evening. First of all, just because I'm here in the Kinghan Church. And secondly, this presentation is in memory of Janet Beck's mother and father, you know, that McCullough Memorial series. So it really is very special for me to be here this evening with you all. I'm going to use Irish Sign Language in my presentation. It's not my native language. I'm hearing, so I would have grown up speaking, and I learned ISL at a later age. My BSL presentation skills aren't great. I have tried before to present in BSL, but there was lots of mistakes, and I think it's better to focus just on ISL and then give it over to the professionals to work into proper BSL. Leave it to the interpreters tonight. We have two interpreters this evening. We have Amanda Mohan. So I'm going to be signing in ISL. Amanda will voice over in English, and then Janet Beck will work into English. Just also to let you know that Amanda Mohan is my wife. Just wanted to be very upfront about that at the start. Okay? So to begin, and to talk a little bit about myself, and John has already mentioned a few details about me. This is my sign name. It's a C hand shape on an L hand shape. And in December of... God, hang on a second. Amanda, when was it that I passed the Viva? Yes, just in December there, I became a doctor after 9 years of studying for my PhD. I looked at deaf history as part of my thesis, and I was looking at a specific area of deaf history. John's already mentioned it, including courts, prisons, workhouses, and deaf people that were in workhouses, in prison, in court, that I came across in the course of my research. And quite a lot of information I did come across. So I've selected some of that information this evening. I'll be talking specifically about cases I've come across in Belfast. In terms of Northern Ireland deaf history, I certainly don't know everything. I'm not an absolute expert in this area of deaf history. I have done research on an all-Ireland basis, including Northern Ireland, but I wouldn't know the in-depth ins and outs of Northern Ireland deaf history. I've selected some cases that feature deaf people in courts and prisons, though, this evening, who are from Northern Ireland. But if at any stage you see any factual errors or want to correct me, please do so this evening, okay? Also, just a slight warning here about the content of my presentation. It's not going to be a happy-go-lucky, nice rose-tinted glasses look at history. Some of the cases I'll be talking about are quite sad and depressing. It is about court, prison, workhouses, people in institutions for many years. So, for example, I will talk about child abandonment as part of one of the cases. So if you feel that there's a sensitivity yourselves around that, I certainly won't mind if you leave the room. I won't question that whatsoever if at any stage you feel you're not able to sit through that material. And you can ask any questions at any time, but it might be better, rather than throw the questions at me all the way through the presentation, to try and hold on to them until after the presentation. It might work a little bit smoother if they come at that point, okay? So here we go, Belfast. So throughout the 19th century, the population of Belfast expanded hugely. So I'm talking generally, not just about deaf people. The number of people in Belfast expanded. And you all know a little bit about why that is. All the new industries like shipbuilding, all the other industries led to people moving into the city, and the population grew and grew. So in Dublin, the population did grow. But in Belfast in the 19th century, I mean, at the outset of the 19th century, it was a very small town and it became huge at the end of that period. It grew far more rapidly than Dublin. And we can say the same about the deaf population of Belfast. If we go back to 1851, we compare the figures here for Dublin and Belfast. But there wasn't much growth in the decades after that for Dublin, and there was in Belfast. So have a look here at the statistics. You can see Belfast's deaf population growing and growing. We don't have information for some of these periods, but we do have this information here. So in 1901, the position of Belfast and Dublin had been reversed. So Belfast became the biggest deaf community on the island of Ireland. And in the south of Ireland, a lot of people would just assume Dublin, sure, of course, Dublin's got the biggest deaf community in this period, but the statistics very clearly say otherwise here. So it could be a bit of a shock for some. So of course you all know this building well, I'm sure. I won't go on too much about it because it'll be old news to you. Yeah, FP. This was a building known as FP, as many of you know. Yeah. So later on, it became the RNID, but it was still very much known as FP by the local deaf community for Fisherwick Place. And I won't go on into too much detail about it because you're very familiar with it. But one thing that really took me aback was starting from about the 1880s to the 1920s. This building had so many societies, clubs, organisations that were established in this period. So you can see a list of them all here, and there are more than these. These were all established in this period, so the building was very busy. The deaf community was highly active during this period, as we can see. And this word here, in the first item on the list, Ephata. So this was a Bible reading association. So you might have a teacher that would read a portion of the Bible and go through it in sign language, and then there would be a group discussion in sign language by the deaf attendees about that Bible section. And we can see the spread of organisations here in the Belfast deaf community. And the Ancient Order of Free Gardeners is a particularly interesting one. We'll come to that later. But we can see that the deaf community was vibrant, it was lively, there was lots going on. Really interesting stuff. So this is from 1925, this photo. I was quite surprised when I found it in a newspaper. And the newspapers quite often published articles or photos to do with the Belfast deaf community in this period. It would talk about FP, it would also talk about here, the King Mission. Lots of press coverage, including photographs of the Belfast deaf community at the time. This is not something that you saw in Dublin. You didn't see photos or articles about deaf club doings in Dublin, but you did see that in Belfast. So this is one example of that coverage. This is a group of deaf people preparing to go on their yearly outing, this group trip. And they would do this fairly regularly. I think here they were going to, it doesn't mention where they were going to in this photograph, but regardless, they would often go to places like Portrush, or maybe Port Stewart. So quite a lot of the time they would go to the beach or seaside towns for these outings. So you could see lots going on in this community, a very busy, active, vibrant, alive community. So that's the deaf community. We can see it was thriving at the time. Let's talk a little bit now about the courts and the law and things like that. So you might know this building. This is a building I still haven't gone into and visit. I know it's closed down. I think it was maybe the 60s or so, the 50s or the 60s, that the courthouse shut down. But from the 1850s or so to the 1920s, this was a very busy building. Lots of court cases going on all the time. And a lot of deaf people had legal business in this courthouse, taking the oath, being cross-examined, being defendants, witnesses, and we'll see some of this later on. So that's the court, and obviously if things went badly for you in the courthouse, you'd end up in this building. And again, I haven't myself gone into the Crumlin Road jail, unfortunately. I keep missing out my opportunity to go on one of the tours. I'm going to get around to it one of these days. Okay, so now to talk. Sorry, what was that? No, I haven't gone into it yet. No, not into the prison. Unfortunately, I am going to one day visit that building. Okay, so the period I'm talking about is between the 1850s and the 1920s. And for my PhD research, this is the time frame I looked at. And my research looked at old newspapers in this period. Many of these newspapers have now been photographed and digitized and placed online, and you can do word searches. So you can type in the word deaf, for example, and see lots and lots of results for newspaper articles that mention deaf people. So I collected instances of deaf people in court all around Ireland in the period. I created a database of all these cases. And for the entire island of Ireland, I would have found something in the region of 1,100 cases featuring deaf people. In Belfast specifically, I have some numbers here. I found 121 cases. So that's 121 cases, not necessarily 121 deaf individuals. Some individuals might have come to court several times. They might have been repeat offenders, for example. But overall, 121 occasions, 121 times where deaf people were in court. And these legal proceedings in the court featuring deaf people were of three different kinds. So most of them were criminal cases. There was, they broke the law, for example. There were also some cases of inquests. So when someone died unexpectedly, you would have a jury being called and an investigation into the cause of it. And deaf people often were called to these inquests because they discovered the deaf body themselves, and they were asked to come along as witnesses to the inquest and give evidence by interpreter or by written notes or so on. So 4 times I found deaf people involved in these inquests, and then we have civil cases. So one person might be suing another for some kind of cause, and I found deaf people involved in 3 civil cases. But as you can see, the vast majority of these featuring deaf people were criminal cases. 114 of them. So of these 114 cases, these criminal cases, 84 of these cases featured the deaf person as a defendant. They were being accused of this crime. They were summoned to court. The charges were presented to deaf defendants. However, sometimes the deaf person was the person bringing another person to court, accusing the other person of something. So 24 occasions saw a deaf person, maybe that had been beaten up or had had money stolen from them, something had happened to the deaf person, and then they had gone to court accusing the other person of a crime. Or something might have occurred that a deaf person saw. They might not have been directly involved, but they were a bystander. They might have told the police about something that they'd witnessed and then had agreed to arrive in court and to be a witness for that case. So that's some of the stats there for Belfast and deaf people in courts. So you might be wondering, how did that work at the time? Did deaf people have interpreters? I mean, what do you think? Do you think interpreters were around for that? Do you think maybe they used written communication? Okay. Well, the answer is yes. There were interpreters around at the time. Were they trained and qualified interpreters? Were they registered interpreters with NRCPD, for example? They weren't. Not at that time, no. But people were around that came to the courtroom and interpreted for these deaf people. So I've mentioned the cases featuring deaf people, 121 of them, and of those, 46 of those court appearances featured an interpreter. Now, as I've mentioned, I got this information from newspaper articles, and so I counted the amount of times it was mentioned there was an interpreter in court. But sometimes interpreters aren't mentioned at all. They could have been present, but it just doesn't specify in the newspaper article. Maybe they were there, maybe they weren't, we just don't know. So 46 times there were interpreters mentioned. 15 times the interpreter was a teacher or a missioner connected with deaf people. So often, the deaf missioners or the deaf teachers of Belfast, maybe a teacher in the Lisburn Road School, for example, might have been asked to come along to interpret in those cases, or a missioner, maybe from the Kingham Mission or from FP, might have come along to do that. And we can see some of the names of these interpreters at the time in that category. So John Kingham is the first name there, very connected with this building. Also the Reverend Dodds. See the third name there, Joseph Tillingast was a teacher in the Lisburn Road School. And we can see some other names there of people. So teachers and missioners were often interpreters, or what you also found. Sorry? Oh no, these would have been hearing people. Those that I mentioned. However, there were deaf interpreters. Yeah, we'll see later about that. But these names that I've mentioned here are hearing interpreters, but keep that in mind about deaf interpreters, yeah. So you see some family members here, maybe siblings or children of deaf adults, on 6 occasions acting as interpreters. What's really interesting is if you look at the All-Ireland statistics in terms of deaf people in court, I would have expected prior to the research, sure, I'm sure we'll see a lot of interpreters who had deaf parents, a lot of coda interpreters. It's the case now that's a high proportion of interpreters. But at the time, there were very, very few children of deaf adults doing this. Now, you might think that 6 out of this 46 is a quite small proportion of interpreters who are family members of deaf people. You might have expected a bigger proportion, but there you go. We also have policemen as interpreters, and that happened quite often. Policemen would volunteer their services, and it seemed that most of the time they were just using two-handed finger spelling to interpret. They weren't fluent signers. So it seemed that they were just finger spelling every single word in an English sentence, which could be very, very confusing for deaf people looking at this, right? So these policemen were acting as interpreters. They were often described as being really good interpreters. I have my doubts. And we do have deaf interpreters. And one person who often came in this role to interpret in the courts is Francis McGinn. Yeah. So Francis McGinn would have often appeared in court working with, let's say, deaf-blind people, or, in a variety of different situations, he'd be present as interpreter. Okay? So, from here on in, we're going to talk about a few examples of deaf people who appeared in court in Belfast. I'll talk a bit about these examples. And these examples vary quite a lot from each other. There's lots of different kinds of situation. I was thinking before I might talk about 5 different situations. I've picked 4 But, I didn't want poor Amanda to be suffering here, voicing me over for even longer. So I've cut that down to 4 examples rather than 5, just thinking about the interpreters and our limited time today. Okay, so we shall begin and talk about this case. And is your name Black as well? Oh, wow. You're here then. Okay. It's a different Agnes that she's talking about here. So this is a case from a good while ago. Well, there's 2 Agneses here. Okay, maybe there's some distant family connection there with yourselves in this case. Might have to do your family tree and find out, who knows. So just to talk about this girl here, Agnes Black. Who was she? So this is a case from a good while ago, and this was a deaf girl called Agnes Black. She entered into the Lisburn Road School, 1858. She was from Ballymacarrot. And then there's another deaf person involved in this case, a deaf boy. James Hoy or Hoey. The spelling of the name really depends. The spelling of the name varies in newspaper reports. A few years older than Agnes, bit of an age gap there. Yeah, so the boy was older. James was older than Agnes. And they were a couple. They were courting, as they used to say at the time. Courting, holding hands, walking along the promenade, all that kind of thing. So, what happened with Agnes and James? Well, there was a little bit of trouble with the law that occurred. Sorry, give me 1 minute here, guys. You might not be able to read this article extract very clearly, but I'll explain it. Agnes was arrested, and she was accused of stealing a sum of money. She protested her innocence, but still she was brought to court. So this newspaper article says that a hearing woman accused her of this theft. Rebecca McFadden is her name. And Rebecca and Agnes had known each other previous to this. They were good friends. They were next door neighbours, in fact. So they knew each other. They were friends. Agnes had taught Rebecca the finger-spelling alphabet. They used to communicate using this amongst each other. And Agnes would often come over to Rebecca's for a cup of tea. They'd sit down and have a chat. Agnes asked if her friends could come over at a certain stage, and that was fine. So apparently often you'd see sign language conversations going on in Rebecca's house. Rebecca seemed to be absolutely fine with this. So how did this incident happen? Well, what Rebecca said to the police was that Agnes had approached Rebecca and said, "Oh, I would just love to go and get my picture taken, but I don't have any money. Could I borrow some money, maybe just a few shillings from you?" Rebecca said, "Well, I've got a note upstairs, hang on a second." So she got the note, and she was going to go to the pub to get change for the note. So she got some change, put the change in her breast, and then gave Agnes the money that she wanted, took the rest of the money from her breast and put it in under her pillow. But Agnes saw where Rebecca had put the remainder of the money. So Agnes went off, said thank you, went off, got her photograph taken, and then apparently, this is what Rebecca said, went back to Rebecca's house, took the remainder of the money from under her pillow and went off. And then later on, when Rebecca went to look for the money under her pillow, it was gone. And there was only one person that knew that that money was there, and that was Agnes. And also a servant as well was there and said, "Yes, I saw it was Agnes, she took the money." So Rebecca's not very pleased about this, obviously. So she was furious. She told the police, "This deaf girl Agnes is after stealing my money." And so that led to the police arresting Agnes, bringing her to the police station and questioning her. And Agnes said that she was innocent. So then this matter ended up in court, and this is where we join it. Okay, so we're now in court. This is what Rebecca has said. Agnes is now called to the stand. Now, I'm not sure from the newspaper article whether there was an interpreter there, but communication seems to be effective. Maybe written English was used to communicate with her. And she was asked various questions. She was asked, did you take Rebecca's money? And she said, I did not. My boy gave me £10. And the crowd in the courtroom started laughing. Her boy? Who was her boy? What did that mean? And then someone else in court said, oh yes, well that refers to a deaf boy that she's currently courting with. The judge at that stage took an interest in this and said, well, I would like this deaf boy to come here and act as a witness, and maybe we can question him. So that's when James Hoy came along. He was sworn as a witness, promised to tell the truth and all the rest of it, and was asked, did you give Agnes £10? He said, yes, I did. And where did you get this money from? He said, oh, the school principal gave it to me, Principal Kingham. He gave me a cheque. And I went into the bank, I cashed the cheque, and then gave Agnes the £10 that she wanted. So the judge was very eager to know, why did you give Agnes £10? And he said, because I want to marry her next week. And the crowd in the courtroom had a good old laugh at this and said, oh, God love them. Now, just to say, through the midst of all the questioning and the cross-examination, it seems that people have got things wrong. Rebecca, the hearing woman, apparently had maybe taken the money from Agnes rather than the other way round. This money that Agnes had got from James, her boyfriend, Rebecca may have taken. And then later on, when Agnes asked Rebecca for money for the photograph, it was this money that Rebecca took and then put the remainder under the pillow. And Agnes was only later on taking her own money back from under the pillow. So the judge was taken aback by this turn of events, and it looked like maybe Rebecca wasn't being entirely truthful. And Rebecca was asked, the money that you had, where is it from? Oh, well, there was a gentleman that gave it to me. And where is this gentleman? Who is it? And then Rebecca was very hesitant and asked for the court to be postponed till the next day so that she could ask the gentleman to be present in the court. And this was agreed to. There was an agreement that there would be a break in proceedings at this point. After the break, when the various people came back, Rebecca didn't come back. She had done a runner at this stage. She wasn't there. So the judge at this point said, hang on a second. Rebecca's accusing Agnes of stealing money, and now it looks like the entire opposite has in fact occurred. The judge decided to drop the case and apologised to Agnes and said, I'm very sorry, you are free to go. There is no stain of doubt whatsoever in your character.
And Agnes's solicitor was very angry and said, well, seeing as how Rebecca has accused my client, you will see us again in court where charges will be brought against Rebecca. So it was a very messy case in that sense.
So I suppose it was a happy ending for Agnes in the sense that she didn't have to go to prison, she wasn't fined or anything like that at all. But I suppose there's a sad aspect to the story for me. After this court case, I wanted to research and see, well, did Agnes and James actually did get married? Did they get married? And it doesn't look like they did. I'm not quite sure what happened after that with Agnes and James. Did they break up? Did they find different partners? Did they pass away? It's not entirely clear. So yes, at the end, the judge said to Agnes, "You can go." And the judge said, "In all my life, I've never seen such a confused mess of a case." Very, very confusing for the judge, and so the case was dropped. Because the judge could not tell what was going on, what the real truth of the situation had been. Okay? So that's the first example from Belfast, and we're moving on to the second one here. So this is a deaf woman from later in the period, around about 1917 or so. And this is her name. I've seen spellings of her name C-A-R-N-E, sometimes C-A-R-N-E-Y. I've seen it spelled both ways, Mary Carn or Carney. She was born around about 1893. Again, she went to Lisburn Road. And when I was researching Mary's life, it appeared that from the 1901 census anyway, that Mary Carn was in Lisburn Road School. I could see her on the census form return. In 1911, in the census, I couldn't locate her. And then when I was looking through the reports from FP, from the Belfast Mission Hall, which had lists of regular attendees and members, Mary's name doesn't appear there. So she might not have been deeply involved in the deaf community. Might not have been central. Or, maybe she did attend sometimes. It's not entirely clear. So in 1917, Mary became pregnant. She gave birth to a baby boy. We're not really sure who the father is. The birth certificate itself doesn't mention the identity of the father. Where the father's name will be written is blank. And then when the baby was about 5 months old, Mary was arrested and brought to court on a charge of child abandonment. So let's go back to 1917 and the birth of the baby. So this is the baby's birth certificate here. So all babies who were born had to be registered in this way at the time. But you can see that there's no mention of the father's name. So when the registrar asked Mary, she didn't mention the father's name perhaps, or didn't wish to give it, and so it wasn't recorded. The baby's name isn't recorded here either, because at the time, maybe just after the birth of the baby, Mary hadn't decided what to call it. So some of these sections here in the birth cert are blank. Okay, so what happened in 1917 with Mary and her baby? How did this abandonment happen? Well, after Mary was arrested and questioned, she gave some of the answers to this. So Mary's baby, it looked like Mary wasn't able to support the child, wasn't able to look after the child, and so approached a hearing woman who knew Mary, but not well. They wouldn't have necessarily been good friends, but they would have known each other. One day Mary knocks on this woman's door and basically offers the baby to the hearing woman. Mary wrote a note saying that I can't look after the baby, can you please look after the baby? The hearing woman brought her in and offered her a cup of tea and some food at that point, but said to Mary it would be better to go and look for other people to help because she was not able to. So she recommended Barnardo's as a place to go for some support. It was a home for children and maybe Mary could go and leave the child there. So after this, the hearing woman, Victoria Fraser, told the police it looked like Mary was very, very attached to the child. The child was a little bit dirty, but otherwise looked well and healthy. It wasn't a case of Mary not wanting or not loving the child. There was that sense of love, but just unable to look after the child that she picked up on. So at this stage, Victoria is recommending Mary to go to Barnardo's. What happened next was, you can see the building here. This is at Malone Place, and it was a maternity home. It was supposed to be for pregnant women who were not married. So that is where they would go to have their children. But Mary already had her child. The child was 5 months old. She just didn't know what else to do. So she ended up going to Malone Place. And a woman who was working there in Malone Place late at night, a nurse, at about 10:30, was just going about her duties when she heard a noise at the front gate, some kind of sound. She went and investigated, didn't see who had knocked the door, didn't see who had caused that noise, went back to work. And about 15 minutes later, she heard the sound of baby crying. And she went down and discovered a baby that had been left on the gate. She didn't see who had left the baby there. They had gone at that stage. The nurse realised that Malone Place wasn't the most appropriate place for the child, and so decided to leave the child in the local Belfast workhouse. And it looks like the next day, Mary regretted what she'd done. And she went to a woman called Lillian Dodds, who I think is the wife of Reverend Dodds, the missioner to the deaf. She went to Lillian Dodds and said, "I think my baby is lost. I think maybe my baby is in the Malone home." So Lillian agreed to go to the Malone home with Mary, asked where the baby was, and Lillian realised that something was up. That yesterday Mary had left the child at the Malone home and said, "I'm very sorry, but I have to involve the police at this stage." So the police ended up charging Mary with child abandonment. The case came to court, and there's not a huge amount of information in the paper about what happened. At the time, people could be quite sensitive in relation to things like child abandonment, and sometimes it wasn't that the newspapers would print loads of information. It would actually be that they would print very little information. They didn't want to talk about this. It does appear that the court didn't give her a prison sentence, maybe just let her go out of sympathy. But the child was not given back to Mary. Mary wasn't given a second chance with her child. What happened was that the baby was about 14 months old. Until the baby was about 14 months old, he stayed in the workhouse, but then died of fever at a very, very young age. The workhouse was very near Lisburn Road, actually, very near the deaf school. So the deaf school and the workhouse now are both demolished, but they were very near each other. Yeah. Okay? All good? Okay. So that's a bit of a sad case from Belfast. But we can see from that first and second cases that deaf people weren't found guilty of charges or weren't even accused of charges. And you can also see as well that sometimes it's just a case of poverty. Maybe Mary wasn't able to look after her child because of poverty. Our third example is a little bit different, as we'll see. So this is a deaf woman, Mary Wilson. It's not entirely clear where she was born, whether it was Lurgan or Derry, but it was about 1864 anyway. So I'm not quite sure where she was born. She was born in Ireland, but her family then emigrated to America, and she went to an American deaf school, so presumably she would have learned American Sign Language. After a while, Mary ended up back in Belfast. So she met local members of the Belfast deaf community, and she got married to a deaf man from Belfast. David Wilson was his name. I think he worked for Harland and Wolff. He was a driller in the shipbuilding company. But, Mary at that stage was married to David. And she for a while worked as a smoother in a linen factory. A smoother I saw as a job description. I'm not quite sure what it's to do with. Is it to do with ironing? Oh, someone here knows. Oh, okay. Great, thank you for that. I wasn't quite clear what that job entails, so thank you for that. Sorry, yes, it's just been said to me here that a smoother was like an industrial kind of ironing machine to get linen pressed completely flat and without any creases. So at this stage, Mary's married, she's working, but then she starts to get in trouble for stealing, and there's lots of examples of her being accused of larceny. She's also developing problems with alcohol addiction. One issue with Mary is that the people that she's stealing from are deaf people. You could possibly say that had she been stealing from hearing people, the deaf community would have been disappointed, but the anger they must have felt when Mary was stealing from them in this very small, close-knit community, you can imagine how much worse that would have made it for Mary in the deaf community. And a lot of deaf people ended up being fed up with her and wanting nothing more to do with her. It might have been different if she was stealing from other people who were hearing. She might have still received community support, but stealing from deaf people, that must have been a big no-no, and she didn't get support after a while. So here's an example of that. It's an example of a deaf girl, Kate McGoldrick, and Mary Wilson stole a dress from her and some money as well. So you can imagine the reaction to that. And this kept happening. This is another similar case of that. Again, from a deaf woman. I've done some research into this lady, Sarah Jane Irvine. She was deaf. So she was accused of stealing women's clothes, a hat, rolls of fabric, fabric for making dresses. Mary was accused of stealing all of this. And so the police arrested her, and Mary Wilson resisted arrest, ended up biting a policeman's finger. A very painful wound, apparently, according to this article. So this kind of trouble came up for Mary on several occasions after this. Mary eventually became pregnant and had a baby boy called David. However, this is his birth record here, and you can see something interesting about where the child was born. You can see here that Mary was pregnant, was accused of stealing, arrested, brought to prison while still pregnant, stayed there for the duration of her sentence, and the child was born in prison. What's interesting about Mary for me as I was going about researching her life were the amount of letters that she wrote herself that I came across. These would be letters saying how sorry she was, asking for her time in prison to be reduced, for her to be released early. And I've got an example here. So these are Mary's own words, and that's her own writing in this. I remember looking at these letters and thinking that shortly before this, her child, who was born in prison, was taken from her. And I'm not quite clear what happened to her son David, whether he was adopted. I've tried to locate him and I can't find him. I think maybe he was adopted and his name has changed. But after that, Mary was expressing in these letters how much she missed her son. But it looked like that she never got in touch with him again. She would never had the opportunity to look after him again. So this kind of legal trouble continued for Mary, and judges eventually lost patience. One problem was that she developed this addiction to drink. She was an alcoholic. And because this kind of trouble continued for her, what happened at the time was, and you'll see a record of this here on the screen, this is a record from a specific kind of prison for people who were alcoholics. and it was in Ennis in the west of Ireland. So eventually the judge said, look, this kind of thing has been continuing for far too long. I'm sentencing you to 1 year in Ennis Inebriate Reformatory. So you can see Mary's criminal history here, all the time that she'd been accused of theft, all the different court appearances, one after the other. She's described as deaf and dumb in this prison record. So she goes to Ennis for the year, and it turns out that Mary quite liked the situation in Ennis. She found that it was actually a good place to serve her time, and she found it better in terms of conditions than Belfast prison where she'd been before. After that term had expired, she came back to Belfast. But with the inebriate reformatories, once inmates were released, the institution wanted to keep an eye on them and to make sure that the behaviour was good. So when Mary went back home, or when other inmates would go back home, the reformatory would keep in contact with the local police, where the inmates were discharged to keep an eye on their behaviour. So for Mary, when she finished in the inebriate reformatory, she went back to Belfast. But the reformatory authorities, wanting to keep an eye on her behaviour, got in touch with Francis McGinn. And we have letters then that Francis McGinn sent to the reformatory about Mary's behaviour, seeing if she was on the straight and narrow or otherwise. And these letters came regularly. There was this correspondence between Francis McGinn and Ennis about Mary and her behaviour. And this is an example. So Ennis wanted to check how is Mary's behaviour, and the reply from Francis McGinn on this occasion was, no, unfortunately not, she is in trouble again. McGinn said that 1 year in Ennis Inebriate Reformatory was too short a period. She should have had a longer term of 3 years there. So there you go. This is another letter that Mary wrote herself. The husband at this stage had decided to leave Mary, which left her heartbroken. She says, my husband doesn't support me, my heart is broken, and you can see this all in the letter. He's abandoned me. And this is interesting here. Oh, Francis McGinn doesn't want me to live with him. He's rejected me. And I'm sure at this stage Francis McGinn was fed up of all the support that he had given to Mary, and yet this trouble kept continuing. So how can you continue to support Mary if she keeps drinking, if this trouble continues all the time? I'm not saying Francis McGinn is a bad person or a good person for taking this attitude. We can't really say, we can't talk about the rights and wrongs of something that happened so long ago. But it's a very hard situation for Mary. She's addicted to alcohol. She's living in poverty. So we also can't judge her actions in the same way. Really interesting, though, in this case is that you come across the use of a deaf interpreter. So this is about Mary Wilson, this particular article that I found. She was arrested. The police questioned her, but Francis McGinn came to the police station. So in the course of their questioning, maybe it wasn't going to work without an interpreter, so they contacted Francis McGinn. Francis McGinn was given a written question to ask the prisoner in sign language. He would then get Mary's answer in sign language, write it down, and give that back to the police. So that's the way that interpreted situation worked. So you did have a deaf interpreter. And I know we have deaf interpreters now, but we often think, well, they always work together in a team with a hearing interpreter, don't they? Well, not in this case. Francis McGinn worked solo here. So I think it's an interesting one. So these letters from Mary continued, and you could see her emotional state, the pain that she was going through, and the poverty that she lived in. She said, I need clothes. My husband never gives me new clothes or new boots. I have to steal. I need money from somewhere. So that's what she said anyway. Then Francis McGinn himself in court talks about the problems Mary has had over the years. He was obviously called in as a witness at one stage for one of Mary's court appearances. And this is what he said. I'm very sorry. I've known her for 20 years. She is constantly addicted to drink. I have tried my best to support her and to try and make her stop drinking, but there's just no chance whatsoever. So in 1916, Mary ends up in a different prison in Dublin, Mountjoy. She undergoes a 3-year sentence there. Leading up to that, her sentences have been quite short, a few weeks, then a couple of months, then maybe 6 months. This continues. Eventually she gets a 3-year penal servitude sentence in Mountjoy. She's there for a long time. At least in Belfast prison she was near her home, but now she's all the way over in Dublin, and that really seems to have affected her. You can see her letter here. She talks about being lonely, that she's a jailbird. I suppose it's a bit of a funny phrasing, but it's also sad at the same time, isn't it? She's getting older and she's worried that if she spends much longer in prison, she'll die there. Her health is in decline. Yeah, she's getting older and older at the time. Yeah. So, in my research about Mary, I've come across so much evidence, so many letters about her written by her. I think her life story is really, really interesting. But after this point, I'm not really sure what happens with Mary. I don't know if she dies. I don't know if she goes to England or if she goes back to Belfast or where in Ireland she might have gone. I've hit a bit of a wall in my research after 1916. However, I do have photographs of her that I can show you. So she was given this 3-year sentence just before 1916. She goes to Mountjoy, and in Mountjoy there are pictures taken regularly of her. So the first time that she goes into jail, there's a picture taken, and then regularly after that. And as you go through the photographs, you can see the change in Mary. Okay?
So if you look at her life altogether, if you add together the amount of time that she spent in prison and reformatories, it came to 9 years of her life. And her husband David just seemed to have completely abandoned her. I know that at one stage it looked like he moved in with a widow. And Mary at one stage complained about her husband. Oh, he left me and he's living with some widow now. And it turns out that that widow was deaf as well, actually. I don't know if they ever did get back together. I can't find any evidence of that, but it looks like the husband just had enough of Mary and left her, didn't get back with her. Okay, so that's someone who has been in court very often throughout their lives. We're going to have a short video next, and it's an opportunity for the interpreters to take a break. The video isn't to do with Belfast, but it's an Irish example. We've seen how there were interpreters for deaf people in courts, but what you also saw is deaf people saying that they wanted to communicate in writing, and sometimes the level of English literacy was very good, and they were well able to challenge other people in court using their handwritten challenges, showing a certain amount of agency. So we'll just look at the video which shows one example of that. Okay, have you had enough of a break there, interpreters? Okay, so that example shows that deaf people could go into court and without interpreters could use written English to challenge others within the courtroom setting. Now, sometimes, of course, if barristers and solicitors wrote a question in very lengthy, difficult legal language and gave it to a deaf person, this would lead to confusion. They didn't always understand that question. So there is that element to it as well. Now, I have given a presentation in Belfast about this subject before. Maybe some of you have seen it. If you haven't, don't worry, we'll go through it again. The British Order of Ancient Free Gardeners. Anyone heard of that group before? No? Okay. I think it's a brilliant piece of Belfast history, and Belfast deaf history in particular. So what was this order? Well, technically it was a mutual aid society, which meant that in days gone by, before the NHS, before sick leave and free medical services a lot of the time, you didn't have that kind of free healthcare, free health services that we enjoy now. And there wasn't really much you could do about it. So, sorry, there's a question here. Yes, and it is a bit confusing because they actually don't have anything to do with gardening. You're right, and I was the same before. I was thinking, what is this reference to gardening, gardeners? What kind of gardening are they talking about? I just think it was some kind of name they made up for themselves. Now, it's possible that 300 years ago, really this began as a group of people who were gardeners, but as time progressed, the gardening aspect lessened and people with other professions and trades came into it, but the name persevered. But that's fine. Yeah, no, thanks for the question. But as I say, I was confused myself when I started researching this. Who are these gardeners? What's the gardening? Okay, so this mutual aid society, as I say, would have regular members who join. They might pay £1 a week as membership fee to the order. And then if a member was affected by sickness or a family member was affected by sickness or illness, then the society would make a contribution. So we didn't have the NHS at this stage. This was about people joining an organisation, helping each other out in this membership-based way. And it was a quite popular way of doing things in Britain and Ireland, that kind of mutual aid society. So in 1893, this was the first time that a lodge... Now, just to explain that, so the Ancient Order of Free Gardeners would be all over Great Britain and Ireland, and it was divided into different branches, and they were called lodges. Right? So the branches around Britain and Ireland were called lodges. Each branch was called a lodge, but this isn't to do with the Orange Order. It wasn't a lodge in that religious sense. That's just what they call them. So it wasn't a religious organisation that we're talking about. In 1893, then, you had the establishment of the first Deaf Lodge of the Free Gardeners. And every year, all the ancient free gardeners would get together for a kind of a congress. And in 1893, this congress was in Paisley in Scotland. Sorry, Paisley, used the wrong sign for Scotland there. So this conference decided to establish a Deaf Lodge for the first time. And the Deaf Lodge was based in... No, the very first deaf lodge of the Ancient Free Gardeners was based where? Belfast. The Belfast Lodge. So at this delegation meeting in Paisley, they granted permission as a body for the deaf mutes of Belfast to establish a lodge. Yes, this is 1893 that this lodge was established. So that was the start of the lodge, and Francis McGinn was the figure really who started it all off. And a year after that, we can see here that Belfast was the site of the Free Gardeners' overall conference. There were presentations given, and a year previously the Deaf Lodge had been set up at this stage, right, in 1893. Here in 1894, the conference reported on the Deaf Lodge and how well they were doing, just in the year that they had been in existence. And in the same year, typically at these meetings you would have hearing people getting up giving speeches. But at this meeting in 1894, Francis McGinn was called to the stage and asked to give an address. And so he took the floor. In front of all the hearing delegates, he gave them thanks and gave a presentation. So that was the first time a deaf person had been asked to address the Ancient Order of Free Gardeners. So he reported that in the year since they'd been established, they had 37 members already. They hoped to increase that to 50. At the time, the Deaf Lodge had all deaf members. Francis McGinn was the chairperson of that lodge, and he was deaf himself. There was one hearing person involved in the Deaf Lodge, and his name was Matthew Sands. You can see the reference to him there. Brother Sands, Matthew Sands. He was hearing. He operated as secretary of the Deaf Lodge. He was in charge of letter writing and correspondence with the other lodges and so on. So Matthew Sands is an important character. We have to keep him in mind for later on. So we can see here the word Ephatha. Yes, you're absolutely right. It's Greek for may your ears open. So this book, this membership book, I found in Prony, the Belfast-based archives, right here in Belfast. That's right, yeah, Ephatha, yeah, it's a word from Greek. So this was a rule book for members of the Deaf Lodge. You can see the logo there for the Ancient Free Gardeners. So the book talks about what the lodge is for, what the purpose of the lodge is. It's all there in the membership book. If a deaf member joined, they would get one of these membership books and they could record their contributions, their weekly contributions in this book. So this continued success for the lodge. The membership grew and grew. Every week, the membership fees came rolling in. They accumulated into quite a lot of money in the bank. And other lodges, or members of the Deaf Lodge, gave a lot of credit to Matthew Sands for his hard work in making this happen. In 1897 here, we can see that the Deaf Lodge had actually more money than all the other lodges in Belfast. So in terms of membership fees, they'd accumulated more than other Belfast lodges had. And the deaf members of the lodge were very grateful to Matthew Sands for his hard work, and so they decided to present him with a gift for gratitude for the work he had done. But again, just remember, Matthew Sands is hearing. He's the only hearing person that's working in this lodge. So they got him a beautiful clock and presented that to him in gratitude for his service. So he was very honoured to receive that and all the rest of it. You know, how nice. Sorry? Okay, so within the lodge, what did they do? I suppose they didn't really have discussions. I suppose it was more like, they did have meetings, but it's really more about the weekly subscription, the contributions that they made. And then if someone was sick, they would get information about that sickness, send off an application from the central lodge, and then if that claim was successful, the member who was sick would be able to get a contribution towards health services. It just meant security. They knew that if they paid that weekly contribution, if they did get sick or a member of their family did, that they'd be okay in relation to the money aspect of things. And there was lots and lots of different lodges all around Northern Ireland and Great Britain. And it's just one of these lodges in Northern Ireland was all deaf members, and it did very well. Lots of contributions coming in, not that many claims in terms of illness. So it all seemed to be going very, very well for them. And later on, women were involved. Yes, women became members, and I suppose, There is a photograph here of some members of the Ancient Free Gardeners marching. So all the hearing and deaf Ancient Free Gardeners marching in procession here. And so they were singing, and also there was an interpreter there to sign the songs for deaf members. So that's nice. No, I'm not finished yet. Not quite yet. There is more to come. Things take a turn at this point, right? In 1915. So what happens in 1915 is that there's an audit of finances, and it looks like there's some inconsistencies in the books. And it's discovered that Matthew Sands had been falsifying claims, pretending that members of the Deaf Lodge were sick, taking the money, and then pocketing it and not giving it to the deaf members. So this was reported to the police, who came to arrest Matthew Sands. But when they arrived at his house, Matthew was in the middle of trying to commit suicide. He was trying to do this by using a gas oven. He opened the oven, turned on all the knobs so that the gas was coming out, and put his head in the oven. The police bashed open his door and managed to arrest him before he committed suicide. So he didn't succeed in taking his own life, but he was arrested and he was in prison until his court trial came up. So the newspapers were very interested, and they were publishing lots and lots of stories about this case and about Matthew Sands, that he'd been taking all this money. I think in total it was something like £234 he had pocketed. So £234 at the time would be the equivalent value today of, we actually have it here. So that was back in 2018, 22,000. So it might be even more now. It might be worth £25,000 in today's money. Well, I'd like to represent the hearing community here today and express my deepest apologies for his actions. So this is talking about Matthew Sands trying to commit suicide, but as I say, he was arrested before that can happen. So the trial date comes around, and this is a very big trial. Lots and lots of deaf witnesses were called to testify, and there was an interpreter there in court. Each deaf witness, they were all members of the Deaf Lodge, and their name had been put down as someone who was sick or who had been injured. And so all of these deaf members were called and asked had that been the case, and they all said, no, I'd never been sick, I've never been injured. So one by one, they were asked, are you a member of the Deaf Lodge of the Free Gardeners? Were you sick on this date, or were you injured on this date? And all of them said, no, I was not. So this was a long process of all these deaf witnesses being called, but all giving the same story. We can see some of the examples here of them. So here's an example. So Matthew Sands would have filled in a form falsely to say, oh, well, this deaf member of the lodge, his wife was ill. And so later on in court, that deaf member said, no, I don't have a wife. So there was lots and lots of fiddling with the books that Sands had done. People who had claims put in saying they were sick were never sick. They had never received compensation from the society that Matthew Sands had asked for. They had never got money from the Free Gardeners at all, despite what Sands had documented. So this is a big trial. There's lots of deaf witnesses to go through. There's lots of people to call. So you can imagine how difficult it was to interpret this trial. And you can see there, William John Stewart, I think he was a teacher in the Lisburn Road School, was the interpreter. That was a big day of interpreting. At that time, you couldn't say, oh, we require a team of 2 interpreters. At the time, it was just a case of, you're the interpreter. And so you'd be working all day. You can imagine the 2 interpreters here. I mean, fair play to the 2 of them, even for doing this, let alone that kind of court case. So all these deaf witnesses were called, and then the very last of them was Francis McGinn himself. Now, Matthew had said that, oh, yes, McGinn has checked and examined all my accounts. McGinn then testified, no, I never did. His signature was on some documents, but McGinn in court said, that is not my signature. I never signed that form. So you might be thinking how terrible this is, but why on earth would you do this? Why would you steal that money for yourself? The lodge had done so well for 20 years. Matthew Sands had received this clock as gratitude. Why would he take all this money for himself on the sly? It turns out that it was drink, really. He was addicted to alcohol, and this money was going towards that habit. This was just one way for him to get money. All he had to do was falsify these claims, and he'd get more money for alcohol. So the court proceedings continued, and at the end, the judge reflected on the case and said, despite Matthew Sands, the defendant, expressing his sorrow and his regret, he has hurt people. He has hurt people who are vulnerable. And so he was given a prison sentence of 10 months. He was then sent to prison. And then after the 10-month sentence, he emigrated to Canada with his family. You think he should have got a life sentence? Okay. I'm saying nothing. No comment from me. But it's kind of funny because at the time, you might have a poor person who might have committed an offence like theft, maybe just a small bit of money, but they would get quite a heavy sentence. But then a rich person might have expressed regret and might have been fined instead. A poor person couldn't afford a fine, so they had to go to prison, maybe for the same offence. And I suppose you could say, in a way, the same thing happens now. But what happened to the Deaf Lodge? The secretary is out of the picture. Does it collapse? Actually, it doesn't. It keeps going strong. And for many years after Sands was sent to prison, it continued. So the hearing secretary is out of there, and so they appointed a new deaf secretary. And things went fine. The organisation continued. I think it came to an end around about 1948 or so. And that was about the time that the NHS was established. So you didn't need an organisation like the Free Gardeners, but it did keep going after all this. So in 1924, we can see here that there was a new secretary in place, a deaf secretary, W.J. Smith. And it looks like 1915 marked the beginning of a low point, but through a lot of hard work, the lodge was able to pull itself up out of that and become successful again. Until 1948, when the NHS was established, which meant free healthcare for everyone, and the lodge was no longer necessary. Okay, and that's it. That's me finished, thank you. The NHS would have started 1948. 48, yeah. Yeah, I think it's 48 anyway.